Hello friends, let us see now other examples of marathon GHG inventory discussions. Example number 50, we will see now. Okay. Example number 50, scope 3, purchase goods and service. So we are talking about the printing material now, 500 units. This is the emission factor. So these emissions are from the printing materials, basically coming from the manufacturing printing material like paper, ink, toners, cartridges, including energy use and transportation emissions. So this data we get for emissions from the suppliers, and this is a calculation, the total number of units bought and multiplied with the emission factor. Then scope 1 emission again, like GHG emissions from the refrigerants, basically emissions coming from refrigerants used in the industrial cooling systems. Leakage of, let's say, R22, a potent GHG, into the atmosphere contributes significantly to the global warming. So refrigeration system like R22 we are taking example. Then 50 kg of R22, there is the emission factor. Okay, and this data is coming from IPCC default emission factor for refrigerants. IPCC is a reference source. There is a calculation, total quantity of the refrigeration agent, refrigerants, multiplied with the emission factor. This is the calculation. The next example is scope 2, indirect emissions from purchased electricity for data center cooling, and the amount was used of electricity 5000 kilowatt. Okay, this is the emission factor. Emission factors are coming from the, let's say, national average grid factor for the data center and utility data or local utilities basically. So cooling system in data center consume a lot of electricity, which is typically generated with a mix of fossil fuel, and this results in indirect emissions from the energy consumed actually basically. Then there is the calculation, 5000 units, okay, multiplied with the emission factor. Then example number 53, scope 3, business travel, and very good example, long distance flights. Let's say travel distance 2000 kilometers. This is the emission factor coming from EPA, average flight emission per kilometer. Emission resulting from air travel where fossil fuels, let's say specifically jet fuel, are burned and releasing CO2 and other pollutants in the atmosphere. And this is the calculation, multiplying emission factor with the total distance of the flight. Let's say example number 54 is scope 3, downstream transportation, shipping via air. So 1000 kilometers is the distance multiplied with the emission factor, emission from air transport shipping. So the reference of emission factor is EPA. The emissions coming from air freight used to deliver the products. Air transport is one of the most common carbon intensive method for long distance. So this is the calculation, distance traveled multiplied with the emission factor. Example number 55, scope 3, employee business travel, rental car is being used 500 kilometers. This is the emission factor. Again, average emission factor for the rental car. CO2 emissions coming from basically combustion of the gasoline or diesel in the cars. Okay, and this is a calculation example. Reference of emission factor from EPA. 56 is scope 2, indirect emission from purchased electricity, like electricity consumed for office lighting purpose, 2000 kilowatt. Okay, emission factor, the regional electricity mix is giving the data for emissions factors. Local utility we refer for this, and there is a calculation, electricity consumed multiplied with the emission factors. So as you know, we are using the electricity for lighting purpose in the offices, which is contributing indirectly for emissions depending on the mix of fossil fuel. And again, scope 3, purchase goods and service, office furniture, how many units bought, emission factor, and this emission factor coming from suppliers data. There is the calculation of the emissions total, emissions from the production of transportation of the office furniture. So basically we follow the LC approach here also, including which type of material we are talking about, wooden, metal and plastic. Scope 1, GHG emissions from fleet vehicles, company trucks using diesel, what is the quantity of diesel used, emission factor. which is coming from EPA. So diesel powered again combustion, CO2 emissions and pollutants, others pollutants where fuel is burned to the engine actually. 59 is scope 3, again end of life the treatment, where we are talking about the disposals of electronic items. So these disposal of electronic item, these include energy and recycling process, transportation, disposal sites. Okay, so generating the emissions in that sense. E-waste disposal factor, we have to take example of the reference EPA, and then these are the number of units multiplied with the emission factor. Okay, next example is scope 1, GHG emission from energy production. We are utilizing natural gas. Okay, natural gas extraction. What is the quantity of natural gas? 2000 meter cube. And is the emission factor, again methane and carbon dioxide is the emission sources. Emission from gases extraction. EPA is the reference. This is the calculation for this total emissions which are generated from natural gas extraction. So emission from extraction of natural gas which release both methane and CO2 as part of the process. Scope 3, use of sold products. Let's say selling electric vehicle charging. Okay, 100 units charger electric vehicles. This is the emission factor. Emission based on charging the electricity grid mix. Local utility should be referred for taking the emission factor example. Then is the calculation. Total number of units multiplied with the emission factor. So here emissions are associated with the charging electric vehicle depend upon the electricity grid mix, fossil fuels or renewable. Scope 3, employee commuting. Again, very good example, carpooling. This much the kilometer traveled. Emission factor, carpooling emission factor which is coming from EPA. This is the calculation done. So carpooling are lower compared to single occupancy vehicle because of multiple people sharing the ride, and that's how we reduce the emissions. Okay. Scope 1, again example of office heating where we use natural gas for heating purpose. This is the cubic meter natural gas used multiplied with the emission factors. Then standard emission factor for natural gas which is coming from EPA. These are the calculation examples. Okay, how did the calculation happen? And as we know, direct emission from natural gas burns to heat, again generating CO2 emissions. 64, example is scope 2, purchase electricity for what purpose? Electric vehicle charging stations. This is the quantity and emission factors. So again taking a reference example for utility providers or regional grid average. Okay, emissions from charging stations for electric vehicle, assuming the electricity coming from fossil fuels and renewable. Scope 3, again business travel. Very good example of using trains. 1000 kilometer distance is the emission factor in EPA for train emission factors. And there is a calculation where we see emissions are generated from fuel. Okay, basically when we travel through train and fuel burning, depending upon the energy mix, again let's say in the train we are burning the fuel plus renewables also. We can think about the mix actually. Example number 66 is scope 3, purchase goods and service. Very good example. In each and every office we utilize paper products. So this is the weight, emission factor, emissions from the production and transportation of the paper. Manufacturer data is providing this emission factor. So basically emissions from producing paper and its raw material, again LCA approach. So think about the deforestation and transportation emissions as well. Example number 67 is scope 2, indirect emissions from purchasing electricity for IT infrastructure. Almost very similar calculations. So here we are utilizing the electricity for server and other IT infrastructure in the office using grid source energy. 68, scope 3, downstream transportation, delivery through trucks. So what is the distance traveled, emission factor, delivery truck emission factor, EPA reference source, calculation, emissions from trucks used in final stage product deliveries because it's a downstream transportation. So burning the diesel fuel, yeah. So final stage product deliveries basically to the consumer section. Scope 3 example, employee business travel, long distance train, again very good example. So travel factor from EPA for GHG emissions, and these again emissions coming from electricity or diesel consumed for long distance train journey. So in the train they're utilizing either electricity or the fuels. The next example is scope 1 again for hybrid vehicles, GHG emissions from company owned vehicles. Basically this is the gasoline or fuel used. Okay, the emission factor, you say emissions from hybrid vehicle that use both gasoline and electricity. So while the electricity used is directly accounted for scope 2 already, and the fuel consumption is a part of the scope. So very interesting example where both scope 1 and 2 calculated. Okay. Scope 2 indirect emissions for lighting system. I think this we have already discussed. These were units of electricity consumed multiplied with the emission factor, and then we can talk about the reference sources, regional grid mix actually. Next example number 72, scope 3 upstream transportation, basically raw material transportation we are talking about, where emission generated during the transportation raw material from suppliers to the manufacturing facility where we are using the trucks and other heavy vehicles. So we take example of reference emission factor from EPA, and this is the travel distance, then emission factor, multiply them together and you will get the answer. Scope 3 upstream transportation, again shipping the raw material through ship and through sea route. Okay, this is the distance traveled and emission factor, again average shipping emission factor we consider here. The emissions basically produced by shipping raw material over long distance by the sea, and again which has lower emissions per kilometer compared to land transportation. Okay, then scope 3 waste generated in operations, like when waste is being sent to landfill. Very nice example. What is the quantity of the waste sent for landfill, and then we consider here landfill emission factor referring EPA. Calculation done, emissions from decomposition of the organic waste, where basically we took example of the organic waste where we are generating methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Example number is 75, scope 3 waste generated in operations, but what we are doing with the waste, recycling of the paper. Okay, so 500 kg recycled, this is the emission for paper recycling, where during the recycling phase itself energy used during the sorting, processing, reprocessing of the paper actually. And this data we get from the manufacturer, emissions from paper recycling, and that's how the calculation is done. The total quantity, the weight in kilogram multiplied with the emission factor. 76, scope 3 end of the life treatment of the solid products. We are talking about the recycling. Earlier also we have discussed the same thing. So emissions associated with the end of the life disposal electronic products, including like transportation is also included, recycling, energy uses. Basically again LCA approach you have to adopt for this. 77, scope 3 where we are talking about upstream lease assets, leased office space, let's say square meter area, 1000 meter square. Then this is the emission factor for leased office buildings, and again we refer the regional data for this. Basically emission is coming from energy which is being used in the office building. This includes heating, cooling, lighting, typically use the grid energy also. Scope 3, one more example, leased machinery, leasing the assets upstream, 1000 hours. This is the emission factor for leased equipment, referring EPA website, calculation done, multiplying the hours with the emission factor. So emissions from energy used by machinery, of course leased from the third parties, okay, third parties. This includes the energy consumption from fossil fuel based equipments actually. You can take example of the rental generator also and other machineries. Scope 3 business travel, long distance business travel, where let's say 15 kilometers, this is the distance traveled, and we talk about the bus emission factor which is referred from EPA. Again the emissions are being generated because of the fuel burning in the buses actually. Scope 3 employee commuting, bus commuting, like what is the distance multiplied with the emission factor. So average bus emission factor which is referred from EPA. So it's a public bus transportation system used by the employees commuting to work. Buses are also more efficient than single passenger vehicles, so same like carpooling what we have done. Okay, so still we generate the emissions through this. Scope 3, employee commuting using their own motorcycles for commuting. This is the distance traveled multiplied with the emission factor. So basically average motorcycle emission factor we utilize from EPA. Again, burning of the fuels, releasing carbon dioxide and other pollutants. Scope 3, upstream transportation of equipments, 500 km multiplied with the emission factor. This is again truck by a truck. So truck fuel burning or combustion will lead to certain amount of emission.